What do we want with this vast, worthless area? To what use could we ever hope to put these great deserts, those endless mountain ranges, impregnable and covered to their very base with eternal snow? Mr. President, I shall never vote 1 cent from the public treasury to place the Pacific Coast 1 inch nearer Boston than it is now. Senator Daniel Webster.
When President Jefferson acquired the Louisiana Purchase, the expectation was it would take centuries to do anything about settling this part of the world because it was so vast with immense distances between points of civilization.
Prior to the Industrial Revolution, people lived in a very natural way. They got up when the sun rose, they went to bed when the sun set. It was a very agricultural mentality. The Transcontinental Railroad completely changed the sense of time in America.
On the eve of the Civil War, the average American had traveled no more than 5 miles from their place of birth, and the idea of settling the Trans-Mississippi West was little different than the notion of colonizing the moon. Shortly after the war ended, these assumptions and doubts were carried away in a cloud of smoke, surging from the stack of a steam locomotive. The building of the American railway network completely changed the country's conception of time, space, and destiny. In 1861, there were approximately 20,000 miles of track, with passenger service limited to major population corridors. By 1868, the American rail network had doubled in size and accounted for nearly half the track laid in the world. The following year, on the arid plateau of Promontory Summit, Utah, a landscape that epitomized the image of a barren wasteland formerly associated with the West, Leland Stanford of California hammered home the last spike of the Transcontinental Railroad. Telegraph wires along the rails carried the news instantly from San Francisco to New York. Suddenly, the American West, an undeveloped area so vast that all of Europe could fit inside it, could be traversed with the rest of the continent in as little as 7 days.
It annihilates what had been apparently insurmountable distance. It saves enormous amounts of time. It enables people to haul minerals, agricultural produce, and people less expensively and more rapidly than any machine or any system of transport in history up to that date. The sheer size of the railway with its engineering constructions, its bridges, its fills, its tunnels, it was the greatest engineering work yet on the planet.
Enticed by swift, affordable railroad passage and prolific promotion, wave after wave of immigrants came west. The migration that started 10 years earlier with the Pikes Peak Gold Rush and American Homestead Act intensified, while the great tribes of Plains Indians saw their ancestral lands and sacred customs rapidly slipping away.
Native Americans had already been suffering a lot of displacement, cultural and physical destruction. And we think progress is always good. But to Native Americans, progress meant destroyed cultures. We lost tribal nations, we lost languages, and we lost Native Americans. Millions of them paid the price of this thing that we're calling progress.
But much of the country believed that God himself had ordained the domestication of vast wild lands as the manifest destiny of a superior civilization. By 1890, the American frontier, considered just 1 generation before as inaccessible, had effectively ceased to exist. Standing in its center, on a site that 10 years before was little more than a duck pond on the edge of a dying frontier town, was the ultimate symbol of manifest destiny, a giant cathedral-like structure venerating the power of the railroads and privilege of a people. It was the largest building west of the Mississippi, Denver's Union Station. rise of Denver as one of the greatest railroad hubs in the West was by no means assured in the 1860s. A dusty mining supply town 600 miles from the nearest population center, Denver teetered on the brink of collapse throughout the decade. Its only hope for survival rode on the steel rails winding west from Omaha.
The Transcontinental Railroad was the difference between economic life and death for gold camps and settlements in towns like Denver. Denver was on the edge of an ocean of grass, and the railroad was the steamship that was going to come and save these poor castaways.
When the announcement was made in 1865 that it was not coming through Colorado, but instead was coming through Wyoming, the vice president of the Union Pacific, Thomas Durant, declared that Denver was now too dead to bury.
And overnight, half of Denver heads up to Cheyenne, figuring that's going to be the Rocky Mountain metropolis. Denver came close to dying. It was losing population in the mid-1860s when editor Byers, the Rocky Mountain News, our greatest promoter, and Governor John Evans decide if the railroads won't build to Denver, Denver will build to the railroads.
Community leaders rallied, forming the Denver Board of Trade, which on November 11, 1867, created the Denver Pacific Railroad and Telegraph Company. People of means gave money, while others volunteered labor in exchange for stock in the new 106-mile line to Cheyenne. Grading began the following spring. Just over 2 years later, on June 24, 1870, Denver Pacific Board members assembled on the roof of the First National Bank on Blake Street to watch the first train from Cheyenne snort into view. Thereafter, the reports of Denver's death would prove to have been greatly exaggerated.
So in that decade, all the major rail lines arrive in Denver. You get the Kansas Pacific, the Denver Pacific, the Colorado Central, the Denver and Rio Grande. So from 1870, when the railroad arrives, until 1880, Denver grows from a little over 4,700 people to 35,000 people.
Overnight, Denver transformed into one of the most spectacular boom towns in American history. Timber, tools, and other merchandise poured in from the east, while in the other direction went cars laden with cattle, coal, grain, and ore from the Colorado Rockies. The mines of Leadville were so productive that their output alone supported 3 dedicated freight lines for 30 years. By 1880, just 10 years after the completion of the Cheyenne Spur put Denver on the map, the exploding city housed no fewer than 13 railway depots. Speculative business minds began to recognize that if all Denver's depots could be combined into one, then the man who did that combining would reap huge rewards. Few were surprised when that man turned out to be New York City railway tycoon Jay Gould.
Gould and other Eastern capitalists believed very much in the idea that you needed to impose order on chaotic economic systems. So if there were too many competing railroad lines with too many different gauges, that was a chaotic situation, and the best way to control that was to impose some sort of vertical or horizontal integration where you control every aspect of a company. John D. Rockefeller was doing it with oil refining at the time. Andrew Carnegie was doing it with steel production. And entrepreneurs such as Jay Gould went after railroads.
Gould had already made millions through ethically questionable but financially brilliant speculations in railroad stock. In 1873, he took advantage of a nationwide economic depression to buy a majority stake in the Union Pacific at bargain basement prices. Then, after a protracted battle with Kansas Pacific stockholders, he succeeded in taking over that railroad in 1879. Thus controlling Denver's 2 major trunk lines to the east, Gould was firmly in control of the city's railroad future. His first move was to advocate, along with Denver's preeminent real estate developer Walter Scott Cheeseman, the rerouting of all Denver rail lines into a single united depot.
It was by far the largest and the most elaborate building in the city, the original 1880 depot, and of course was the most stylish building in town and gave people hope that Denver really was going to become a city.
Built in the middle of 12 acres on a distant and deserted edge of town, Union Station stretched to 880 feet in length and 140 feet in width, including platform and tracks. The building itself was built in an elaborate French Gothic style with double-pitched mansard roof and giant dormer windows trimmed in Manitou sandstone. The outer walls were made from rough-hewn lava stone and trimmed with white and red sandstone, all quarried in Colorado. Inside, the luxurious second-floor offices for the various railroad companies were finished in French walnut. But by far the boldest architectural statement came from a 180-foot tower reminding each passerby of Denver's ambitions to be not just the Queen City of the Plains, but one of the most important new commercial centers of the world. As hotels, warehouses, and stockyards quickly grew up around the station, this ambition seemed less and less far-fetched.
It was this mammoth train depot out on really what was the edge of town. But its gravitational pull was such that the town of Denver really grew towards Union Station. It totally realigned the streetscape of Denver. Instead of having a main street line with Larimer Street, Denver's commerce would take place along 16th Street and 17th Street, radiating out onto the eastern plains from the doors of Union Station.
Denver uses the railroads to build a huge spider web of steel that taps not only every corner of Colorado, but also the surrounding states. And this enables Denver to rise to become the Chicago of the Rocky Mountains, the regional metropolis, dominating not just the state of Colorado, but the entire Rocky Mountain region.
On May 31st, 1881, S.R. Blonger, a mining superintendent from Leadville, became the first person to purchase a ticket from the newly opened Union Station ticket office. He traveled to Chicago on the Royal Rock Island Line, but soon, passengers traveling to points east from Union Station would have a choice between 6 routes, and travelers to California could choose between 3. Within just a few years of its opening, Denver's Union Station serviced 60 passenger trains per day.
As a class, the passengers traveling west from Omaha differed greatly from those with whom I journeyed to Omaha from Chicago. A considerable proportion consisted of adventurers bound to California to seek their fortune. Very few were traveling for their pleasure. To nearly everyone, the journey is a new one, partaking of the character of a daring enterprise. William Fraser Ray, 1874.
Following completion of the Transcontinental Line in 1869, rail travel, once exotic and dangerous, was becoming part of everyday life. For the subsistence farmers, ill-treated laborers, and failed businessmen with nothing left to lose, or the true pioneers who simply wanted to be part of building something new, there was soon no substitute for the journey west. The railroad journey soon became the stuff of legends, spun by writers with a gift for romanticizing the charms and challenges of the wide-open country. Through much of the 1870s and 80s, collisions, fires, hostile Indians, and the extremes of nature made the trip west genuinely perilous.
If you wanted to ride on the train, you accepted the dirt or the cinders. Back in the early days, why, there was no air conditioning on the passenger cars. And so the air conditioning was opening the window. You opened the window and the cinders came in.
Derailments from poor track and grading were routine delays, and all able-bodied male passengers were expected to help hoist the train back onto the tracks or clear away the snow. The experience varied considerably depending on the fare a person paid. First class was relatively plush with sleeping cars and other amenities, but few could afford the $111 fare, approximately $1,500 in today's dollars. Third or immigrant class cost $40, but even this cheaper fare often amounted to every penny a working class person could scrape together over a period of years. And for this fortune, their reward was to be herded onto crowded, stifling emigrant cars where sleep was nearly impossible. Added to this was the misery of hunger. The early trains carried little food on board, relying on scheduled stops where passengers were herded off into a hotel or other way station for refreshments. Those at the end of the line would frequently find that both food and time had run out. Still, passengers took comfort in the notion that they would accomplish in a matter of days a journey that just a few years earlier was measured in months. Working behind the scenes to make this miracle possible were the men who ran the trains. a growing army of conductors, porters, firemen, engineers, brakemen, switchmen, track maintenance crew, and ticketing and baggage personnel. For many, the challenges were formidable. In 1888 alone, over 2,000 railroad men were killed in action and more than 20,000 injured.
It is a dangerous profession. Everything that's done is done around heavy equipment that is not forgiving. You do something wrong, you're going to get hurt.
Before air brakes, the brakeman would climb on top of the cars and he would go to where the brake handles are, generally a round brake handle, running up and down on the roof of the cars until it got slow enough that the engineer could control it with the engine brake. A lot of brakemen fell off cars and were killed.
You had to run the railways in a very disciplined manner. And so railway employees in the very beginning were put into uniform. And the organization is almost military. Brass cap badges, a little bit of gold braid for seniority for conductors. So everyone had his own distinct uniform and job.
United by the adventure and perils of their work, the railroaders felt a deep sense of brotherhood, formalized by a growing number of trade unions to protect the interests of workers and their families. Improvements followed. The installation of air brakes made trains safer. Candles were replaced by oil lamps, wood-burning stoves by hot water heat. By the time Denver's Union Station opened its doors in 1881, Western rail travel had achieved a level of luxury and comfort rivaling some of the most prestigious trains of Europe. Much of this was thanks to Chicago industrialist George Pullman, who placed comfortable rail travel within the reach of America's burgeoning middle class with efficiently designed, mass-produced sleeper cars. Pullman staffed his cars with African-American porters and stewards, among them many former slaves. Although restricted to service jobs, they prided themselves on their professionalism. Pullman was soon the largest employer of African Americans in the nation, enabling thousands of blacks to join the ranks of the middle class. Their community in Denver was a short streetcar ride from Union Station.
The Pullman porters brought a great economic base to the Five Points. They had regular salaries, and that allowed them to have and purchase property, as well as they had families. The wives very often were able to stay at home, and they supported the social life. They had their own clubs. They were the sharpest dressed young men around.
The nation's increasing obsession with trains and time resulted in the institution of 4 national time zones, spearheaded by the railroads in 1883. The steady rise in Denver's traffic required an increase in the number of tracks at Union Station from 7 to 13. In 1892, additional baggage and waiting rooms were added, and still the station strained to accommodate its ever-growing burden of people and materials. So much so that 2 years later, an event that might have been deemed a disaster was quickly considered an opportunity.
Union Station didn't escape that plague of all Western cities, and in 1894, a chandelier in the women's waiting room caused a fire that burned the entire center portion of the depot.
Despite the loss, railroad companies were open for business the very next day, and they soon took advantage of the destruction to update and expand the station. Waiting and baggage rooms again increased in size, and a stone clock tower replaced the original decorative tower made of wood. By century's end, Americans viewed the transcontinental railroad journey not as the perilous adventure of a lifetime, but as a trip that might easily be undertaken by anyone who could afford the ticket.
By 1900, it was clear that Union Station was handling more traffic than the existing building could bear. So planners began in the first decade of the 20th century to actually expand Union Station into a larger facility to accommodate this increased traffic. And in fact, it's good they did that expansion when they did, because by 1920 and up to about 1950, Union Station received more trains than it ever had in its history.
The 1914 expansion of Union Station to its current configuration replaced the entire center section with a Beaux-Arts style addition featuring a huge central waiting room with ornate wall sconces and chandeliers. Plaster arches around the ceiling were decorated with 2,300 columbine flowers, festooned high above rows of huge wooden benches that beckoned travelers laden with luggage to sit or even recline. Access to trains was greatly improved by subway tunnels running under the tracks that linked the train platforms with stairways. The American railroad network of track peaked in 1916 at 254,000 miles. By the 1920s, it was estimated that 4 million people passed through Denver's Union Station every year.
And when you couldn't see it, you could hear the whistle. And the train was always, in your imagination, taking you to some place you'd like to go or wished you could go. And it reminded you that the possibilities in life were vastly greater than those of your ancestors.
At the dawn of the 20th century, America's population topped 76 million, with more than a quarter now living in the West. In unprecedented numbers, the migration from rural to urban centers continued, and the cavernous halls of metropolitan railway stations teemed with life. In Denver, Mayor Robert Speer positioned the city to attract more of the country's growing convention and tourism business, landing the Democratic National Convention in 1908. Speer declared the city open for business, a point accentuated just outside the doors of Union Station by a grand entryway symbolizing goodwill toward both arriving and departing visitors. The ornate bronze arch stood 65 feet in height, shimmering in the sunlight by day and bathed in its own array of 2,100 light bulbs at night.
The arch originally said welcome on both sides. It took our Chamber of Commerce a year to realize you didn't welcome people to leave the city, that you did a farewell salutation, so they came up with Mizpah.
What does it mean? People all had different ideas.
Denverites would just tell visitors when they asked you, just say, oh, it means howdy, or farewell, partner.
It's a Hebrew word when someone is leaving, that God should watch over you while you were out of my sight.
In 1917, as the United States entered World War I, it was hard to imagine a more appropriate blessing than Mizpah, at the entrance to a station where thousands of servicemen would take leave of their families before shipping off to war. By the 1920s, Denver's Union Station wasn't just the center of the city, it was a city in itself. 17 different passenger trains came and went just between the hours of 8 and 9:30 in the morning. Narrow gauge, commuter, and tramway lines connected the city to its suburbs and the Front Range, and always there were endless lines of trains moving freight. Union Station had its own library, its own police force, and its own jail. It was the primary sorting center for all the U.S. mail passing through the Denver region. Newsstands, ticket counters, and soda fountain buzzed with chatter and activity all hours of the day and night.
The station had a Union Station restaurant, Caboose Lounge, and the Continental Room. And of course the Caboose Lounge was the bar section of the lunchroom, and this was open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because back in those days, that's the way the trains ran.
Both going and coming was a grand experience, and people today would have a hard time believing that people actually used to go to Union Station for the sole purpose of having dinner or having cocktails. It was a lively place.
Despite growing competition from commercial airlines and buses, the railroads maintained their reputation as the most glamorous way to travel. Railroad technology saw major advancements in the 1930s with the introduction of stainless steel, a material 1/3 the weight of traditional steel, new designs that minimized wind resistance, and the perfection of the diesel-burning internal combustion engine, an engine whose efficiency and ease of maintenance left the steam engine in its dust. On May 26, 1934, the streamlined Burlington Zephyr set a world record by running non-stop from Denver to Chicago, a distance of 1,015 miles, in just 13 hours and 5 minutes. The train reached a mind-blowing speed of 112.5 miles per hour. But that wasn't the only source of its appeal. Renamed the Denver Zephyr a few years later, it was one of the first passenger trains to feature viewing domes on nearly every car. In 1936, the Union Pacific introduced its own City of Denver Streamliner to run from Chicago to Denver. They were destined to become two of the most popular trains in the nation. Gasoline rationing and troop movements in the early years of World War II dramatically increased the demand for rail travel, and the railroad lines competed for this business by offering a more and more luxurious travel experience. Their profits might be made mostly on the freight side of the business, but their reputations rested firmly on the back of the passenger trains.
The glamour of riding the train as a passenger is it was first class. And back in those years, when you went on a train ride, you didn't wear your Levi's and t-shirt. You put on your three-piece suit, wore your hat. Ladies were dressed in dresses and they wore their hats and gloves. When you went into the station, there was a red cap around there to meet you, to take your luggage. It was on the train when you got there. He took care of you. And the dining cars the same way, linens and silver, and it was true silver.
Railroads christened their passenger lines with names meant to capture all the adventure and romance of travel. Few topped the Zephyr, a name derived from the Greek god of the west wind. And then there was the train that needed no poetry to sell its tickets, the ski train. Put into service in 1940, Denver's ski train was soon famous the world over for its spectacular 56-mile ascent to the Winter Park Ski Resort. Adding to the train's mystique was the fact that it passed through no fewer than 29 tunnels along the way, ending with the 6.1-mile Moffett Tunnel crossing the Continental Divide. Even more than the romance of travel, the electric atmosphere of Union Station during the World War II era derived from the troops themselves. Thousands of small-town boys and men embarking on a journey to the other end of the world, uncertain whether they would ever return. Union Station's huge waiting rooms had long been a place where important family reunions and farewells took place. Added to the list now were solemn vows exchanged between a soldier and his lover left behind, the tearful prayers of a mother, the brave but trembling handshake of a father, each bidding farewell to the loved one they might never see again. The end of these farewells always came about in the same way, with a voice echoing through the great hall announcing the departure of another train. At the close of the war, America's railroads were in a rare position of financial strength. They moved quickly to adopt diesel engines throughout their fleets, greatly increasing their profit margins on the freight side. But despite the success of the marquee trains, the number of passenger trains in America was dropping precipitously, from more than 20,000 trains in 1920 to less than half that number by 1950. The decade of the 50s would see two developments with major implications for the long-range viability of passenger trains: the decision to begin construction of an interstate highway system, and the introduction of passenger jet airplanes whose tickets were competitively priced with those of the railroads.
In effect, the railroads were being asked to provide a service to compete with one that was faster in the case of the airplane, more convenient in the case of the automobile, and in both cases subsidized by massive government expenditures.
By the 1950s, airline transportation was overtaking the railroad line, and I think one of the key turning points when you begin to see the decline of Union Station is when they actually put up a neon sign that says "Travel by Train." They're having to exhort passengers to come to Union Station by the 1950s, and certainly by the 1960s, train transportation is all but done.
In 1958, for the first time on record, Denver's Stapleton International Airport surpassed Union Station in the number of passengers served. On July 18, 2009, passengers boarded the 1950s-era cars of the Denver Post Cheyenne Frontier Days train, powered by legendary Union Pacific steam engine number 844. The train made its inaugural run from Denver up to Cheyenne back in 1908. Today it still travels along the historic railbed that helped to put Denver on the map. The annual journey is a major attraction for those wanting an authentic taste of a bygone era. On a smaller scale, in the basement of Union Station, another historical display offers visitors a rare glimpse of American railroading frozen in time. The Denver Society of Model Railroaders' elaborate layout is the oldest and one of the largest in the country. By the 1970s, there were just 450 struggling passenger trains left in America, operated with federal subsidies by Amtrak. More than half of the country's 40,000 train stations had been destroyed, and a movement to demolish Denver's Union Station was gathering steam. Counterbalancing this impulse was a growing concern for preserving Denver's remaining historic buildings. In the mid-1980s, a group of downtown business owners and preservationists joined together to save Union Station from the wrecking ball and preserve lower downtown's character for future generations.
We started a campaign in the wine coop, and we called it SOS, Save Our Station. And we said, even if it's not being used as a station now, someday someone's going to want it as a station, and you could never rebuild it. It would be lost forever.
To bolster their arguments, SOS leaders pointed to a new trend. Shops, restaurants, and residences were increasingly being drawn to lower downtown, precisely because of the sense of history embodied in its streets and buildings. Union Station had stood for 100 years as the hub for the commerce and culture in the Rocky Mountain West. With proper planning, many felt, it could be that hub once again. Replicating the rationales offered by Walter Cheeseman and Jay Gould when building the station a century before, SOS members contended Denver's increasingly chaotic transportation system needed to be rationalized and tamed through the creation of one central multimodal depot. In 1988, demolition plans were scrapped. Denver was now one of the fastest-growing cities in America, with mounting challenges including traffic congestion, parking, and pollution. In the course of the next decade, civic leaders began to explore how Union Station might help address some of those challenges. In 2004, Denver voters approved Fast Tracks, one of the most ambitious transportation plans in recent American history. 122 miles of new commuter rail and light rail lines, and 18 miles of bus rapid transit radiating out from one central downtown hub, Denver Union Station. Community sentiment for the station runs deep in Denver, both for those who remember the glory of its past and those who look forward to the promise of its future. A Union Station that is once again a vibrant center of civic activity and a grand gateway to the city.
One of the great things about any really great historic building is it allows people living today to actually breathe the air, as it were, of people that lived not just 20 years ago, but several generations before. And especially a place like Union Station, this is a point where the past meets the future, and it's got to maintain and preserve that sense of continuity.
We're on the threshold of a new frontier. Denver Union Station is the anchor, and to be able to have the design so that people walk through it and they actually experience the essence of the station.
Union Station has always been a focal point, and that's the one thing about Denver is that we really respect our history, and it's what makes us who we are, and we want to make sure that that's maintained for the future.
I think people around the country kind of look at Denver and the commitment to a rail future and a less auto-oriented future as being another example of that spirit, creating this place where all of the mobility options for people are brought together. Trains and buses and bikes and pedicabs and car sharing and the ability to walk lots of places. The project's completely transformational for the region and for Denver.
The public space around the Union Station is, from my thinking, historic landmark perspective, almost as important as the station itself. And the combination is very powerful. We're looking at 100 to 200,000 people a day utilizing the station area. Hopefully the historic building itself will become not only, as it was before, a gateway to Denver, but now a seamless gateway between the Platte Valley and an expanded downtown. It's definitely a place that is so much a part of the heart and soul of this community.